Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. It's funny how some questions just never get old. And today, we're diving into one that's probably been debated since, well, humans could debate. Does God exist?
Yeah, it's one of those topics that seems to always be relevant.
Right. And there are such strong arguments on both sides, it's hard to even know where to begin. But I guess a good place to start might be like, why do people believe in a higher power in the first place? What are some of the arguments for God's existence?
Okay, well, one of the classic, like the one you learn about in Intro to Philosophy or whatever, is the cosmological argument. Have you heard about that one?
I feel like I have, but remind me.
Basically, it says the universe had to have a beginning, right? And something can't come from nothing. So there had to be a first cause, like the thing that started it all. And many people say, well, that first cause is what we call God.
That kind of makes sense. But I always thought the Big Bang Theory explained the beginning of everything.
It does, but it explains the how, not necessarily the why. Like imagine a firework exploding. The Big Bang is like that explosion, but what lit the fuse? The cosmological argument basically says something outside the universe had to cause the Big Bang itself.
Oh, I see. So it's not just where the universe come from,
Yeah,
but what made the Big Bang happen.
exactly. And there are different versions of this argument, like some that focus on how the universe depends on something else to exist.
Interesting. Okay, so that's the cosmological argument. What about the design argument? That was always kind of blowing my mind. Like, the universe seems way too complex to just be random chance.
Right. It's wild. Just think, like, if the force that holds atoms together were a tiny bit stronger or weaker, stars wouldn't exist. And we definitely wouldn't.
Whoa. So it's like all these settings are dialed in perfectly for us to be here.
Yep. And that's the heart of the design argument. Things are so fine-tuned, there has to be some sort of designer behind it all. Even some super famous scientists, people like Stephen Hawking and Paul Davies, were kind of floored by this. Like, they didn't necessarily believe in God in the traditional sense, but they admitted the universe's fine-tuning is crazy.
So it's not just like a religious thing. Even scientists are impressed by this.
Totally. It really makes you wonder, is there some cosmic blueprint, some grand design behind it all?
Okay, so we've got the universe needing a cause and it being super precisely designed. What about morality? Like, a lot of people tie their belief in God to a sense of right and wrong, don't they?
For sure. The idea is if there's no God, then morality is just like whatever society says it is. It could change over time, no problem.
But then couldn't things that seem obviously wrong, like, I don't know, murder or torture, be okay in some cultures? That doesn't seem right at all.
Exactly. That's what people mean by objective morality. Like, deep down, we feel some things are just wrong no matter what anyone says. And for a lot of folks, that points to a higher power, a source of good and evil that's bigger than us.
I get that. So, like, we've got this inner compass because of God.
That's the idea. It's like
Yeah.
it's like our conscience is tapping into something much bigger.
Okay, so that makes sense. But what about, like, specific religious arguments? I'm thinking of the resurrection of Jesus. That's a core belief for Christians, right?
Yeah, for sure. Within Christianity, the resurrection is seen as huge evidence for God. Like if it really happened, it breaks all the rules of nature, right? That points to a supernatural power at work.
Yeah, but wouldn't that just come down to faith? Like, believing it because you want to?
Well, faith's definitely part of it, but there's actually some historical facts around the resurrection that most scholars agree on, whether they're religious or not. Things like the early Christian church existing, the tomb being empty, and people claiming they saw Jesus alive afterwards. Those things are pretty well documented.
So it's not totally out there, history-wise.
Not at all. It's a complicated topic, but definitely worth thinking about. And then there's the whole personal experience thing, which isn't exactly an argument, but it's powerful for a lot of people.
You mean like when people feel a connection to something bigger than themselves?
Exactly. Across cultures and throughout history, people have talked about these experiences where they felt a divine presence, like through prayer, meditation, or even just being in nature.
Yeah, I've definitely had moments like that where I felt this peace, I guess. Hard to describe.
It's a personal thing for sure, but it means a lot to people who had it. That feeling of transcendence, of connecting with something beyond the everyday world. It's deeply human, you know?
It's wild how that seems to be a common thread, no matter what religion or background you have. Okay,
Yeah.
well, we got to talk about the other side, too. What about the arguments against God? I mean, the problem of evil always gets me. If God's so good and powerful, why is there so much suffering in the world?
Oh, yeah, that's the big question. Theologians and philosophers have been wrestling with that for centuries. It's tough to square the idea of a loving God with all the bad stuff that happens.
Seriously, Natural disasters, diseases, people being awful to each other. It's hard to wrap your head around it.
Right. People have tried to explain it in different ways. Some say maybe God isn't all-powerful or that he can't stop suffering without messing with our free will.
Mm.
Others think suffering's like a test or a way for us to grow spiritually.
So explanations exist, but not easy answers.
Pretty much. For a lot of folks, the amount of suffering in the world is a deal breaker when it comes to believing.
I get that. What about other arguments? Are there any that are less about feeling and more about logic?
Yeah, for sure. Some people point to logical inconsistencies within the idea of God.
Like what?
Well, for example, if God's perfect and eternal, why would he need to create anything in the first place? What was he doing before the universe existed? And if he knows everything, why make beings who do bad stuff and cause suffering?
Huh. It's like those questions challenge the classic God we imagine, the one who's all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good.
Yeah, exactly. It's not necessarily disproving God, but it makes you think harder about what we mean when we talk about God.
Makes sense. And then there's just the whole, like, limit of human knowledge thing. We're tiny beings trying to understand something potentially way beyond us, right?
Totally. We only know what we can observe from inside this universe. Who are we to say what's outside of it, or if there even is an outside?
It's like trying to explain the ocean to someone who's never seen it, right?
Mm-hmm.
They can kind of get it, but not really grasp how vast and complex it is.
Great analogy. Our perspective is just too limited to make absolute claims about God either way. And then there's the burden of proof question.
Oh, yeah. Who has to prove their case? Does the person who believes in God have to prove it, or does the person who doesn't have to disprove it? That's a head scratcher. It really is. It's like a court case for philosophy. Who has the burden of proof?
Totally. And that really affects how we think about the whole question. But honestly, just engaging with all these different arguments, whether you agree or not, it's good for you.
Right. It's not about being right. It's more about stretching your brain and really trying to understand something bigger than yourself.
100%. Even if you never find the definitive answer, just thinking about these things can change how you see the world.
So big picture, where does this leave us? We've looked at reasons for God, reasons against God, talked about history and personal stuff, even gotten into logic and human limits. It's a lot.
It is a lot. And I think one thing to remember is there are smart, thoughtful people on both sides. It's not like one group has it all figured out.
Yeah, that's important. It's not about dismissing anyone. It's about really trying to understand where they're coming from.
Absolutely. And we got to be honest with ourselves, too, about our own biases and stuff. We all come to this question with baggage, you know? Our experiences, how we were raised, our culture, all that shapes how we see things.
Recognizing that helps us be a little more humble, I think. Like none of us has the total truth on lock.
Totally. Being okay with not knowing everything, that's actually pretty freeing.
So for our listeners out there who are like wrestling with all this themselves, what would you say to them?
Keep being curious. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Check out different viewpoints. Listen with an open mind and heart. Finding truth is a journey. It's okay to change and grow along the way.
It's a good one. Maybe it's not about proving or disproving God once and for all. Maybe it's more about how we live despite not knowing for sure, how we treat each other, how we find meaning in this crazy universe.
You nailed it. It's about living out your values, looking for truth humbly, and facing the unknown with wonder.
Well said. And listeners, we want to hear from you. What stuck with you from this deep dive? Any new questions popping up?
This isn't the end of the conversation. Keep digging, keep asking, keep searching for that truth wherever it leads.
Thanks for joining us on this wild ride. Until next time, stay curious out there.